Now, we spoke a couple of weeks ago with our true crime guy, Duncan McNabb, about the mysterious Melissa Caddick case. Now, Melissa Caddick was the con woman who put in place basically a Ponzi scheme and defrauded a whole bunch of her clients and then disappeared. Now, we think she's dead. But a judge has ordered the sale of her home, which is going to leave her husband with no place to live, and receivers are pursuing an apartment that she co-owned with her parents. I guess the question is, though, is it fair to leave her husband and parents homeless and out of pocket? Are partners and family members responsible for the debts of their loved ones? Well, Alex Martin is a litigation expert and Director of Taurus Legal Management. He joins us now. Alex, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen.
But this is an interesting case, isn't it? Because, I mean, there'd be people out there that would say, well, how could her parents and her husband not have known what she was up to? And I guess that would be the argument to say, well, they've got to cop it sweet. But if she was defrauding everybody else, including her friends and some members of her family, they probably had no idea what she was up to.
Yes, well, there's no evidence, as far as I understand it, there's no evidence that the parents or the husband did know what she was doing. And I think we have to assume, if there's no evidence of that, then we have to assume that they didn't know. And in fact, whether or not they knew is probably not all of that relevant. And ultimately, it'll come down to who contributed to the value of the house, and therefore who the house is effectively, in fairness, owned by.
Okay, because I obviously followed the case in the news like everybody else did, but I recently watched the, dramatised documentary that was done recently as part of that Underbelly franchise, and you kind of got the impression that her husband was a bit of a kept man and lived in the house that she had provided. In that case, I mean, what rights does he have? Because we were led to believe in that case that she owned the property and it was obviously funded by nefarious means. He just happened to live there.
Yes, well, as I understand it, that he was bought a Lamborghini by her, so that's a pretty good present from your wife.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The position really is that individuals are normally responsible for their own debts, and so if the house was owned by one of them or the other, then the house would go to pay only that person's debt. But in this case, it was a jointly owned house, so if she paid for the entire house herself, then when the house is sold, it's pretty likely that all of the proceeds are going to go towards her creditors, not towards him. Unless he made contributions financially or did some work to the house or that sort of thing, then it's likely that the whole house, the value of the house, is going to go towards her creditors, not to him if he's a kept man, if you like.
I guess the flip side of that is her parents, who apparently co-owned an apartment with her. This is probably going to be a more difficult one to wade through, I would have thought.
Yeah, so that is more difficult. I think that the parents co-owned this apartment in Edgecliff in Sydney, and they lived there, and they contributed something like 1.1 mil to the mortgage themselves, so they paid off the mortgage themselves. So that's starting to look like they're the legitimate owners of that apartment, or at least partially. So what the court will do then is, when the property's sold, is they'll pay out the mortgage, they'll pay out all the rates and stuff, they'll pay the receiver who's doing the sale, and then they'll divide up the proceeds according to who contributed and how much they contributed. So if the mortgage was mainly paid by the parents, then most of the equity will go to the parents.
So how does this all get determined? Is it forensic accountants that come in and then sort of sift through where the money came from? And because I imagine it's not an easy process to determine which money was obtained by nefarious means and which was obtained legitimately, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a really good point. So, I mean, that had all, at first instance, been a negotiation between the parents and the solicitors for the receiver, and that's happening right now. And they would produce evidence, bank statements and so on, showing payments if they can. Obviously, when you're dealing with a fraudster or an alleged fraudster, then that can become very grey. If they can't be agreed by the parties, then the court would do like a forensic accounting exercise, and they do what they call tracing, which is actually try to trace money coming from Melissa Caddick's hands to the value of the house. And if they can trace the money, then it can be sold, and the money will be used to repay the debt. But if they can't, then the parents will get the benefit of that. So if it all becomes too grey and they're not sure where the money came from, then the parents will probably end up getting more of the value than they otherwise would.
And is there any avenue of appeal if the decision goes against the parents and the husband, which, based on this conversation, it might appear that it will? What
Yes.
options do they have? What recourse do they have, and can they appeal those decisions?
Yes, so that'll be, if there's no agreement by negotiation, or like they can't agree on something they're all happy with, then the court will make a decision, and then then that'll be up to the court's discretion, if you like. And if they're unhappy with that decision, then they could appeal that in the normal way. So that if the court made an error in law, then they could appeal that error. But it's actually quite difficult to appeal these kind of decisions. They'd have to show that the court made a mistake in applying the law. They can't just appeal because they don't agree with the outcome.
Yeah. This was a fairly high-profile case, but how common are these kind of occurrences?
Very common. So maybe not in the case of someone disappearing and being an alleged fraudster of millions of dollars and owning millions of dollars of property in Sydney. So that's all at the big end of town, I guess, and it's a bit more exciting than most cases. But they're certainly very common for particularly spouses to be arguing about how much of the value of a property is theirs. If you've got one spouse who runs a business and goes bankrupt, then the trustee in bankruptcy then will often come after the jointly owned family home, and they'll negotiate with the other spouse to work out how much of the family home should be owned by the trustee in bankruptcy and used to pay debt, and how much should go to the non-bankrupt spouse. That happens all the time.
In this day and age, it's uncommon these days that you would have a couple or a family where there's only one sole income earner. But traditionally, and in years gone by, you might have had, the husband might have been the financial contributor, and then the wife was the homemaker and contributed to the home. How do they place a value on her contribution and, or his or her contribution, depending on how it played out? But does that play into things?
Yeah, it sure does. So there's a kind of a family law overlay. If you get divorced, the family court can adjust property between spouses based on their contribution, and there's a whole bunch of factors that they look at, including financial contributions, so who paid. So if dad's at work every day paying the mortgage, then that's a contribution. But then there's non-financial contributions like being at home looking after children, being at home looking after the household, doing housework and that sort of stuff. There's contributions in terms of actually doing work to the house, so doing maintenance and paying rates and all that sort of stuff. So the court will look at all of the contributions, financial and non-financial, and make an adjustment. In the traditional sort of, one partner at work and the other partner at home with the kids situation, it does often end up 50-50 or 60-40. It often does end up, pretty even when the court has applied all those factors.
And is that based on some sort of formula, or is it arbitrary?
So in the family court, there's a set of factors set out in the legislation, which the court has to apply. So there are specific factors. They can obviously weight them differently in different cases, but there are specific factors that are set out. And similarly, in the bankruptcy legislation, there's factors that need to be weighed up so that you come to a just conclusion. And people who do it, like family lawyers, can often see from the very beginning what's likely to happen. And as I say, it's very rare for it to go beyond sort of 60-40, maybe 70-30, unless you're dealing with a very short relationship where one party didn't contribute much, or where they weren't together for very long.
Certainly a fascinating area of law. Alex, good to talk to you again.
Nice to be on, Stephen. Thank you.
All the best. Alex Martin, litigation specialist and director of Taurus Legal.